A prophet is not accepted in his own country. I find it very funny that Father Kane asked me to give my first Sunday reflection upon this gospel, given this is my home parish. And I think this is because sometimes it can be the hardest thing to do is to, preach or present something or give a presentation on something that you know very well to people who know you quite well. They have memories of you from when you were younger, maybe less experienced. I've done it myself. You're sitting there, seeing people talk about something that they really care about, something that's so important to them, and you think, wow, it's a bit rich coming from them. It's one of those awkward moments where it can be hard to get through the person and see what's actually before us and listen to what's being said. Whether it's a fantastic thing that we're listening to or it's something that just doesn't impact us at all. If it's someone that we really know or we know through an entirely different context, then it can be very hard to look past the person and simply look at the message. It's too easy to shrug it off and think, oh, it's just wee Chris. What does he know? Whilst I've experienced this firsthand, it's good to take consolation, and I think we can all take comfort in the fact that even Jesus himself wasn't accepted in his own hometown. Because I think there's some key things to point out in the context of what happened in the gospel. When Jesus arrives, he arrives with his disciples and preaches in his home temple, his home parish. He arrives as a rabbi, a teacher, and a preacher. It very clearly shows this because he arrives with his own students, his disciples. He's there to open up the Word of God to his hometown in a much more deeper and intimate way than they would have ever experienced before, because it comes from the source, it comes from the Word of God himself, explaining everything he meant. But the people don't want to listen. Now, there's some interesting things with this gospel because I think, firstly, we're not actually told what Jesus taught them. It's simply said that he's teaching in the temple and the people begin to question him, question who he is, where he's from. More than that, we're told that they're offended by him, not by what he said, but by him. This is where I think they begin to wonder how this carpenter that they knew growing up could have such wisdom, such knowledge, because they knew him, they knew his family, they knew his experience, they knew his exposure that he would have had growing up, and yet they couldn't hear the truth being proclaimed to them. Now, for those of you who are interested, we'll put our Greek hats on. I think it's interesting to note here that the word used for carpenter is tekton. And I think it's a very choice word because when we hear carpenter, we think of someone who works with wood, someone who builds things. Plain and simple, a joiner. But it's actually much more than that. Tekton really means craftsman. In the biblical context, a craftsman was someone who could really put their mind to anything. They could build anything, houses, walls, fences, chicken coops, all these things that would be useful for the community. They were in every town and were always asked to do lots of different things. They were the hard-working men who contributed every single day to building stuff for the community. That's who Jesus was, and that's who they knew him as, the working man. Remember that when he didn't leave Nazareth until about 30 years old. That's a lot of experience to have in the community, building things and being known as this special craftsman. I wonder how many houses or basic everyday tools or gates or whatever in Nazareth he actually built and contributed. It's interesting to go back to the point of they despised him, not his teaching. They cut themselves off from what he was trying to explore with them. They couldn't overcome this image they had of him, Jesus the craftsman, Jesus the working man. This is important because for us, it shows us that when Jesus came to earth, he came as a common man with a common life that was filled with common tasks that we face every day. It's important then that we never judge by the externals that we can see and hear about. The worth that anyone can bring to our lives is not always the example that we can see in front of us, but the message that they can bring to us. It can be all too easy to dismiss things because we witness something, some external factor, something that makes us think that message is not worth its time. In the end, if something brings us closer to God, to be ever more like His Son, then how can we ignore it? There are many examples in our everyday lives that we can perceive as someone maybe where we come across as having less experience than us, or they're not old enough to have this knowledge, or we know too well to consider what they're saying. We already know that stuff. And we can be tempted then to ignore what's been offered. New insight, new ways of understanding. Whether we're walking up the main street and come across a street preacher, or we're sitting in here listening to that new Deacon mumble on, or someone just comes in with a different experience than ours, let's try not to just brush it off simply because we know them, or we know what they're like. Don't shoot the messenger, as we've often heard, because these preconceived notions can take us away from what's really important, that message. We have a tremendous responsibility then that we can all have a great aid in helping Jesus do His work in us, or we can hinder it. We can open the door wide for Jesus to come into our lives and help us, or we can slam it in His face. Let's make sure then that when we have a message that might be difficult to us, either because of who it comes from or simply because it's hard to hear, let's not shut it out. Let's hear the message for what it is and work on it and think, how does this affect me? How does this change me? How does this help me conform to Christ? Let's make sure that we open wide that door for Jesus to come into our lives, because then from there we can share that with everyone that we meet. We're called to preach the gospel and proclaim the gospel, not just by what we say, but by what we do. If we take this message then and carry that forward, we can share it with the world, so that again we open that door for Christ forever and always.